Hello everyone, this is the video for Chapter 7, and Chapter 7 takes place at the same time that the Revolutionary War is going on. It's during the Revolution and immediately after, when we're trying to set up the new government for the United States. And this happens as soon as the Declaration of Independence is made. However, officially, hopefully you know this by now, the United States does not become a true nation until September 3rd of 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris and the ending of the American Revolution. Then the U.S. becomes a real country. But even before that happens, they're trying to set up a new nation and laws to govern that nation. And the first thing that they do is they create a confederation. And the document that kind of holds that together is the Articles of Confederation. Now, with a confederation, the states were more a loose body. They weren't really one nation that we would know of today. In fact, most of the states acted like their own smaller nations that just got together and tried to compromise on things and work together. But it wasn't a real nation yet. In fact, the Articles of Confederation had to fail in order for the nation that we know of today to be created. But going into this, at the start, the 1776, after the Declaration was made, the new United States is going through a lot of problems. They have a lot of debt because they've had to borrow money in order to fight the war. They are now trying to control the lands in the West that they've gained. And they're also trying to control trade because now they no longer have England controlling their trade. So now they have to do it for themselves. And at first, it doesn't go so well. But one of the first things that the states do is they create their own constitutions. Each state does. And in their constitutions, most of them create a Bill of Rights. And that is laws made to protect certain rights from any government taking over those rights. And some of them, of course, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, popular consent before taxation, and then, of course, general no searches without search warrants, and also some form of freedom of religion, though most of them still favored Christianity and favored Protestant Christianity. So they were creating those. Each state was responsible for determining how who was a citizen and who could vote. So each state had its own stipulations about who could vote. So some said if you could pay taxes, you could vote. Some said you had to be a property owner to vote. Most of the time, you had to be a white male property owner to vote. Although for a short period of time, some women and some free blacks were allowed to vote until constitutions were rewritten in 1808 to cut out women and freed men from voting. So there's that. So each state was pretty much responsible for coming up with who got to vote. Each state also tried to create branches of government to separate the power, so no one power would have, or no one position would have too much power. They didn't want to create the same thing that was going on while they were fighting England for one power having too much, or one person or one group having too much power. So the document, though, that created the first federal government was called the Articles of Confederation. It had a lot of problems starting out. One of the things was that it didn't give much power to the federal government at all. They couldn't raise funds to fight the war or to pay the military or anything like that. The federal government did not have the power to raise taxes. Only the states could do that. And most states did not want to do that to fund a federal government. They wanted to raise taxes to fund their own state governments. So that caused a lot of problems in the beginning. Another thing with the articles, they also said that the voting had to be unanimous. And so at the beginning of the United States, there were 13 states. So trying to get 13 states to agree on anything was almost impossible. So not much got done with this first government because you couldn't get all 13 representatives to be unanimous in their vote. And then the third thing was that the federal government had no control over internal trade. So each state got to dictate its own trade, its own prices, its own money, currency, things like that. So trading between the states was nearly impossible because things had different values over the state lines. And then money even had different values. So that was really hard for trade to take place between the states. Many of the states, though, were still trying to trade with other countries, and the federal government at that time couldn't control that. So some states had better trade relations than others, even while the war was going on. So good for some, not so great for others. With the lands in the West, that was another problem. The federal government could more or less sell the lands out there and were trying to control it a little bit. They really didn't have much funds. So you had a lot of trading going on with the lands. Some of the states did give up their rights to certain lands to the federal government so that things could get done. There was one ordinance passed called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It established some governments in the Great Lakes region, boundaries for territories, so on and so forth. But it did finally set up how eventually a territory could become a state. So once a territory reached 5,000 male population, then they could elect their own legislature and send one representative to Congress. And eventually, if that territory reached 60,000 for the male population, they could petition to become a state. So that is how the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 set up how eventually territories become states. And so on and so forth. So that was one thing that came out of the Articles of Confederation-ish. Other things, though, while we're fighting the war, of course, we're in opposition with England, so we're not getting to trade with England, or Britain, at the time is Britain. They also cut off trade, most of the trade that the United States was trying to do with the West Indies, but Spain was doing that too. They were trying to limit the trade that the United States could do because they didn't want someone else dominating the markets. And Spain also controlled the Mississippi River at the time, so they cut that off, or they could cut it off whenever they wanted to from using it to get people and goods and all that other stuff down the Mississippi River. And most countries weren't really taking the United States seriously, so they were raiding American ships in order to, capture the products on board. And we really didn't have a navy to protect against that. So we had a lot of problems in the beginning. In fact, the United States almost failed when it began. Because the federal government couldn't raise funds, they couldn't pay the army who was fighting the war. And then even after the war ended, the army was very angry that they're not getting paid. And it was really just George Washington who stepped in, and he's promised that eventually they'll get paid, and they finally stopped rioting. But without him, there could have been even more trouble. But even with that being said, there was another rebellion called Shays' Rebellion. It was led by Daniel Shays in Massachusetts. He had been a former Continental Army officer, but in Massachusetts they started to raise taxes in order to try to, fund their state government and also pay back some of their debts from the war. And a lot of people just didn't have the money to pay it, especially the former army, because they weren't getting paid by the federal government, so they didn't have any money to pay taxes. So they had riots and things like that, and they started to storm the courts because people were being arrested for not paying their debts. So they were trying to stop that, and they even petitioned, the Massachusetts government to not arrest people, but they overrode that, and we're still arresting people. So this big rebellion happens. Daniel Shays, he leads about 1,200 men on January 26, 1787, to a federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. He's going to try to take over some guns and ammunitions and things and have a full rebellion to kind of stop these taxes from taking place. But 4,400 troops were sent to put this down. This was not led by the federal government because they didn't have the money or the power to put this together, but instead East Coast merchants had funded these 4,400 soldiers to go in and put down that rebellion. So it was kind of a private endeavor. It wasn't led by any particular government office or position that put down the rebellion. So it was a private funded mission. 6 people from Shay's side were killed, and the rest pretty much abandoned that idea. But it just showed that things had to change because things were not going very well. And even by 1783, which was the year, the United States officially starts, we were on the verge of financial collapse and only struggled on 4 years after that just by sheer will. But yeah, we just didn't have much money. So finally, by 1786, a lot of the states are saying things have to change. And so they start to call conventions. One happened in Annapolis, Maryland. Only a few people sent few states sent representatives. But what was decided at that meeting was that something's got to be done about these Articles of Confederation. They're not doing their job. So I said, okay, we're going to have a meeting in May 1787 in Philadelphia, and we're going to see what we can do about these articles. Now, eventually we call this meeting the Constitutional Convention because what comes out of the meeting is the Constitution. But first, they're all meeting just to amend or revise or fix the Articles of Confederation. But later on, they scrap them and create an entirely new government. So that's why we call it the Constitutional Convention. And that happens in Philadelphia in 1787. George Washington is president of that convention. 54 delegates are sent. Most of them are wealthy young men who are the elite educated classes from their particular states, trying to come together and form a new government. But within that convention, from the very get-go of our country, the divisions start coming out. So the only thing that really we agreed on, for the most part, except, the loyalists who were against the United States becoming a nation, was the war itself, the revolution, fighting together. That was the first and last time that most people came together for anything. Because after that, there was just divisions, and there still are today. But at this convention, you had North versus South, the northern states versus the southern states. You had merchants versus farmers. And you had the large states versus the smaller states. And that last one was like the biggest issue. So when they got together, the delegates came up with 2 separate plans. The first one called the Virginia Plan, also the Large States Plan, because it favored the large states. They wanted to do away with the Articles of Confederation altogether, create a 2-house Congress called a bicameral legislature. They wanted to create federal judiciary, that's federal court system. And they wanted to have a president, a leader of the country who would be elected by Congress, and a centralized system of government, Congress having veto power over the states. So having the federal government slightly more powerful than state governments to create an actual nation. But they wanted all membership in Congress to be determined by the state population. And of course, smaller states did not like that. So the smaller states came up with their own plan called the New Jersey Plan. And they said, you know what? The articles weren't that bad. Let's just fix them. Let's revise the Articles of Confederation, not replace them. But we need to strengthen the federal government. We agree with that. But each state still needs to have equal representation in a one house or unicameral legislature, because they didn't want to give up their power that they had, their equal powers. Sorry that my dog's barking. Anyway, so there was a compromise made by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and he says, let's create a two-house legislature. The upper house, called the Senate, will have equal representative in its house. The lower house will be called the House of Representatives, and the representatives will be based or proportional to population, and it starts out being one representative for every 30,000 population people. So, for the most part, back and forth, but Benjamin Franklin, who was a prominent citizen, he agreed with this and he approved it, and he got other people to vote for it as well when it was stipulated that all funding bills would start in the lower house and then work their way upwards. So people were happier about that. But the smaller states and some of the southern states were like, who gets to be counted in population? Is it going to be only the people who vote, only the people who pay taxes? Do women count? Do slaves count? The southern states, of course, wanted slaves to count in their population because then they would get more representatives in Congress. But the northerners are like, wait a minute, y'all don't count slaves as people any other time. Why would they count now for representatives? So there was another compromise called the 3/5 Clause, or the 3/5 Compromise, in which slaves become basically 3/5 of a person. And so 3/5 of the slave population, or 3 out of every 5 slaves, would be counted towards representation and taxes. So it was kind of a give and take there. You could be taxed on your population, and you would also receive representatives in Congress. So that was the compromise. And that kind of set up some compromise and happy medium for the time being. But with that, the Constitution was created. And it created the 3 branches of government that we know of: executive, legislative, and judicial. Executive being the president and his cabinet, legislative Congress, and judicial is the court system, Supreme Court being the primary one. Congress was given 5 powers: collecting taxes, raising revenue, regulating trade, both foreign and domestic. So now federal government is in charge of trade, both with other countries and between the states. The Congress had the ability to declare war, maintain the army, and the 5th one, which was the most controversial and caused so many problems along the way, to make any necessary changes to pursue these powers, which is so ambiguous. And that means they just started to take on more and more powers because they considered it necessary changes. But it did set up the government that we know of. But then the question is, how is the president elected? Does Congress have the ability to elect president? How long does the president have their term? Is it a life term? Do they only serve one term? What goes on? Can we have 3 presidents at one time? So a lot of things were tossed back and forth. But finally, someone said, you know what? The president, Governor Morris of, his name was Governor Morris, by the way, of Pennsylvania, said, really, the president that position should not be dependent on Congress. Should be directly elected by the people for 2 terms of office. But the framers of the Constitution were very fearful of true democracy. Because in true democracy, everybody votes for everything, but you're always going to have a minority. And if you're always part of the minority, then your voice will never be heard in government. So they wanted to not have a true democracy. So they created another controversial thing called the Electoral College. So in the Electoral College, delegates from each state are sent to vote on the president. And it's supposed to be the total apportionment in Congress dictates the delegates. So the Senate plus the House combined determines how much delegates you get sent to the Electoral College. And when it's first started, the delegates vote for two people, and the one that gets the most votes is the president, and the one who gets the next most votes is the vice president. So when we start out the country, the president and the vice president had been opposing each other in the election, so that caused a lot of problems too. And then, of course, if there was no majority of votes, then the House of Representatives decides who's president. But the powers of the president: he gets to make treaties as long as they get a 2/3 vote by Senate, oversee Army and Navy as Commander-in-Chief, name diplomats with consent of Senate, execute laws passed in Congress, and have the ability to veto acts of Congress if they are unconstitutional. Now, that was very questionable, so later they said the president can veto acts that are not in the country's best interest, and that also causes problems. We do have a president who does have some power, but the power is checked by Congress, or it's supposed to be. However, over time, the president has gained more and more power, so we have a very powerful president in today's time. The Constitution also set up the judiciary branch, federal court system. The Supreme Court was the primary one and the head, and handles all questions about constitutional questions. Also, if there is a case that the United States is being sued or is part of the case, then it goes to the Supreme Court. If two or more states are in the case, or if citizens from two or more states are involved in the case, it's supposed to go to the Supreme Court. And now also today we have the ability to kind of go up the line, that if a case is tried, within a local or state level, then it can work its way through the federal court system and then eventually go to the Supreme Court to see if it's constitutional or not. And one thing that's happening today with the Supreme Court is the question of if a person's gender identity is covered by the law passed in the 60s about discrimination, and that's taking part in the Supreme Court right now. They're determining that, if that's constitutional or not. So there's that. But the Constitution did say, or with the Constitution being set up, it became the supreme law of the land, that it will always override state constitutions and state laws. And with it, the states are now not supposed to be able to make their own money or levy customs or infringe on obligations of contracts and stuff like that. It takes several years for that to actually take place, but that's what's supposed to happen. Now, once the Constitution's created, it wasn't accepted immediately. One thing the Constitution did say, though, is now you don't need a unanimous vote with all the states. You just need 9 of the 13 states to agree on it. So some states agreed immediately. Delaware, Connecticut, and New Jersey were some of them. They were like, yeah, and Georgia too. But some states were like, I don't know about this. If we agree to this, we're giving up our powers that we had. So why should we do that? So you get a group of people forming called the Federalists. And then, of course, in opposition to that, you get the Anti-Federalists. But the Federalists were John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. Later, John Hancock joins, but John Hancock first is a Anti-Federalist. But what they're doing is they start to talk about why the Constitution should be accepted, what it's going to do. They even create essays called the Federalist Papers, and later those essays were compiled into one document called the Federalist Papers. But they go article by article explaining what the Constitution's about and why it's good for the country and so on and so forth. And it creates the idea of federalism, that the states and the national government share power and no one group is going to have domination over the other. But some citizens do have to give up certain rights in order to have protections and so on and so forth. But that's the idea of federalism. The Anti-Federalists, though, were some very prominent members also. Patrick Henry, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, the great Samuel Adams, who's kind of, the patriot the American Revolution, they were against the Constitution at first because they thought this is creating a very strong national government, and the state governments are not going to have as much power anymore, and that's not what we were fighting for in the war. So why should we do that? And also, this first Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights, which most states had and were in agreement that those need to be protected. So the Federalists were like, well, don't worry, each state has its own Bill of Rights, so we should be fine. But then the Anti-Federalists said, yeah, but you say the Constitution is going to override any state constitution, so our rights could be infringed upon if they're not included in the federal document. But the Federalists didn't want to include them at that point because some states had already ratified it. So if they went to change the Constitution, they would have to start the ratification process all over again and send it back to the states to be agreed upon, and so on and so forth. So this is what they said. We promise that if you guys just accept the Constitution, the first order of business will be to add a Bill of Rights. Just please accept the Constitution, and that's what we'll do, the first thing. So when that was said, John Hancock changed from an Anti-Federalist to a Federalist, and he got Massachusetts and some of the larger states behind him to also accept the Constitution, because he said the first order of business will be to add that Bill of Rights. So the Constitution was finally accepted, and eventually all 13 states accepted, but none, by 1788, none of them had, so the Constitution became the law of the land. And the first order of business that they did was create a Bill of Rights to be added, and we know that as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. There were several, I think over 20, initially proposed, but only 12 made it to the voting process, and only 10 passed. So that's why we call them the first 10 amendments, because they're the ones that passed. There were the two that didn't, probably should have. It specified the number of constituents each representative had. And then the other one was compensation for congressmen. It actually put a cap on compensation for Congress, which we still don't have today. So that might have been something good we should have added, but never did. But the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, in 1791, they're included. And many of you know them or have heard of them. Freedom of religion, no established church, freedom of speech and peaceful gatherings, right to bear arms. That's the Second Amendment, and that's still big today being talked about, because you have a lot of people saying we need to do away with that. But here's the thing. If you open the door for any of the first 10 amendments to be abolished, then that allows any of them to be abolished. So if you say one can be, then they all can be. And that's a very dangerous thing. So just be careful and keep that in mind when you hear people saying we need to do away with the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. I'm not saying we shouldn't have conversations about who can and cannot have guns, but doing away with that amendment is a big no-no. Other things, no enforcement of quartering soldiers in private homes. The government cannot tell you that you have to feed and clothe soldiers in your home. Also, you have to have a search warrant to seize private property, or search properties and things like that. Right to a trial by jury of one's peers. Even though that was put in, once again, it took over 100 years before that was really put in place, because you had to have the entire civil rights movement to have a jury of one's peers for everyone. And then definition of suspension of protection under the law. So anytime, especially the country goes to war, civil liberties will be suspended. So that's also kind of put in there as well. So with the creation of the Constitution, though, the United States becomes a constitutional republic with democratic principles. So if anyone ever asks you what type of government the U.S. is, it is a constitutional republic with democratic principles, not a democracy. No matter how many times people say it, we are not a democracy. So keep that in mind. All right, so that's chapter 7. See you for chapter 8.